Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out on this cold evening. Welcome to what is essentially round 2 of the Talking History series co-production between the History Trust of South Australia and also the University of South Australia. I'm Craig Batty, I'm the Executive Dean of UniSA Creative here at the University of South Australia, and welcome. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting tonight on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present, and also acknowledge the ongoing cultural, spiritual connections that the living Kaurna people have with their lands, waters and community. So we've got a really fun-packed, and it is because I've been talking to the speakers outside, fun-packed evening ahead of us tonight. I'm going to pass over to someone you all know really well, I'm sure, and if not, you certainly will during and after this. The History Trust of South Australia the History Advocate, who is also known as the History Avocado. Now, I believe that an avocado is a fruit, not a vegetable. And I think you'll find that Kiera is very fruity. And also goes a long way as well. But anyway, so I did say UniSA Creative, so I am going to that's my disclaimer. So thank you for coming. Look forward to seeing you at the next 3 events we have here in the Bradley Forum across the year. And thanks to the speakers for taking part tonight. And please, very warm welcome to Kiera Lindsey, Dr. Kiera Lindsey.
Thanks, you can mush me and put me on toast. Smash me, rather. G'day, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's so nice to see you all. Here we are back again to keep that long, ongoing, forever conversation, talking histories. Talking history, talking histories. That's what we're doing in different ways. So welcome. This is the very first of our 2024 series. There's going to be 4 events this year, and they run June, July, August, September. So it's not very confusing. And you can find out more details about the other events on the History Trust website. But just in short, we've got amazing topics, and each one involves a panel of 3 to 4 speakers. And as well as tonight's, after tonight's, we'll have one in July on family histories. August one will be on understanding South Australia's past through art, so painting South Australia's past. And our last one will be that contentious but ever popular topic, South Australian exceptionalism. Is South Australia truly exceptional? Question mark. Okay, so, at this moment, acknowledgements to country can be a rote activity. But I think that is exactly why we need to lean into them as a rich ritual that can remind us that we meet on sovereign and unceded Kaurna land, country which is charged with thousands and thousands of years of storytelling. Despite over 180 years of European settlement, the imposition of survey chains of horses and cows, of trains and trams, and the millions of wires that are now buried beneath the bitumen. Even our beloved Stobie pole. The peaks, the plainlands, the waterways, they still sing with Kaurna songs and history. So history reminds us to remain ever curious and creative about the world around us as we pay our respects to the Kaurna and thank them for sharing their ancient but living traditions. So, my friends, this is the air hostess part of the evening when I get to say, in the unlikely event of an emergency, run. No, check out the security guard, and there are bathrooms available in the foyer if you haven't checked those out. I hope you enjoyed the cheese and wine beforehand. Please turn your mobiles on to silent. Tonight is being recorded and will be made available on the History Trust website in the next couple of weeks. So tonight, our panellists are going to talk for 15 minutes each before we open up the floor for conversation. Now, you're going to notice, I think, that there's 2 speakers instead of 3. And that's because, very unfortunately, Dr. Stephanie James, who is from Flinders University, is unable to attend because of health reasons. And she sends a direct apology and her sincere regrets to the audience. She was so looking forward to doing this. The good news is, however, that she assiduously prepared a paper and PowerPoint, and the lovely Dr. Susan Arthure, who is here on her own stead with her own paper, has generously agreed to present that on behalf of her colleague. So Susan's going to be working very hard tonight, and she's going to need a double clap at the end. Yes. So some of you, just out of interest, how many people attended the Wonder Women Talking Histories that we did last year? Wonderful. Well, thanks to you and your hearty endorsement of the topic of talking about women's history, we're back again, taking the same idea of imposing or applying the theme of the History Festival to the topic of women's history, to see that what we can find out, not only about South Australian women, but also about South Australia more generally. So tonight, because this year's History Festival was none other than power, that is power, in case any of you didn't go or didn't attend some of the 540 plus events that occurred during the month of May, which was the History Festival. Wasn't that an amazing festival, by the way? Did everybody attend something? Hands up. Oh, aren't we lucky to have that festival? It's probably the biggest history festival in the world, we reckon. We don't know yet, but so we can't actually officially make that claim, but I think we will one day. And how extraordinary it is to be able to dive deeply and also flitter across so many different history activities across the state. Well, last year it was Wonder Women, this year it is Power Women. But as we were thinking about this idea of powerful women, Christy Kogeki, my colleague and friend, reminded me that, we shouldn't just look at power. We should also contemplate, consider, think about powerlessness as an intrinsic part, a shadow side, if you like, of the story of power. Sometimes we have to go through experiences of powerlessness in order to find power. And so we're going to be looking at that tonight. In addition to thinking about that idea, as I was sniffing around for ideas, I realised that the 18th of December in 2024, this year, marks the 130-year anniversary since the constitutional amendment, that is the Adult Suffrage Act or Bill, that granted women the right to vote and stand for Parliament. And it was passed in the South Australian Parliament. Woohoo! Around the same time as I was thinking about that, I was invited to launch a wonderful new book by Wakefield Press, which has drawn on decades of interdisciplinary research. And the topic of that book, and one of the editors is sitting on the stage here, Susan Arthure, is Irish Women in the Antipodes. And it was investigating a group of women in society who, as you can imagine or know, have had many experiences of both powerlessness and power. So, as one of the chapters, and this really terrific book was written by Dr. Denise George, who's sitting on the stage with us as well, and it concerned that famous Irish South Australian woman, the radical reformer Mary Lee, who was so pivotal to the process of having that bill passed. It seemed to me that it would be a great way to kick off the Talking History series and to also think about power and powerlessness for women, an Irish woman and a woman who did so much to engage with power and to change power for our lives. So, however, in addition to the well-known Mary Lee, this new edited collection, The Irish Women in the Antipodes, includes many lesser-known Irish women from South Australia. In fact, the collection is dedicated to all Irish women who have travelled to the Antipodes, especially to those whose stories have never been told. And as such, it offers us a unique opportunity to learn more about South Australian Irish women who challenged authority and power, albeit in less orthodox ways. Now, I have to admit I was extremely excited by this book as I was reading it because it's close to my own work, which involves attempting to re-present underrepresented people in history. My first book, The Convict's Daughter, published by Allen & Unwin in 2016, yes, you can buy it, was about my own Irish female convict ancestors. One arrived in chains in the 1820s in Sydney, and the other was born in Australia, but it was involved in a romantic scandal when she eloped with the Attorney General's wayward second son in Sydney in 1848. So in doing that, I started to think a lot about what it meant to be an Irish woman in Australia. And it wasn't an easy story in the 19th century, as I'm sure many of you know. But tonight we're going to enjoy a tantalising glimpse into just 3 of the 16 chapters in this book. We're going to explore some of the stories that span across a long period of time and a diversity of experiences. Nonetheless, the 3 chapters that we're going to look at suggest what the book as a whole confirms, and that is the crucial role of informal networks and conversation in sustaining the female experience in Australia. Close kinship networks are certainly part of the fierce women of Baker's Flat in Kapunda, who our first speaker, Dr. Susan Arthure, will demonstrate in our first talk, which is entitled Rage and Resistance, the Irish Women of Baker's Flat. In this, she's going to reveal how in colonial South Australia, the mining town of Kapunda and its rich copper were once so critically important. Many of its men are celebrated in published histories. But what about the women? That eternal question, eh? What about the women? And especially, what about those women of Baker's Flat, a long-lived Irish settlement on the outskirts of the town? Baker's Flat was located on a contested land, and mostly the women are remembered only in general terms as being rebellious and feisty, seeing off the bailiffs and evictives with sticks and brooms and boiling water. The women's names are rarely used and their individual stories are missing. But this presentation will readdress that absence and name many of those activists and place them in their context in day-to-day lives. So I'd like us to welcome Susan, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of a bio on her. She has a PhD in archaeology, in fact, and this is really important for talking history, where we want experts and enthusiasts across all sorts of history interrogations to be in the conversation. Susan's main interests are the nature of Irishness and the Irish diaspora, with a focus on the Irish Australian experience. Her research into the Irish community of Baker's Flat near Kapunda in South Australia identified and analysed the first complete exemplar of a Clashan and Rundale. I don't know if I got that right, but you're probably going to... Rundale. Clashan and Rundale. Well, you're going to say it anyway, aren't you? A traditional Irish settlement system to be found on the outside island so far. So this is pretty amazing stuff. Something's happening here that's unique, even we might say exceptional. Susan was born and raised in Ireland, but she's lived mainly in South Australia since 1987. Please welcome Susan to the stage.
Thank you very much, Kiera. Very nice welcome. Okay. Hello, everybody. So I want to start by saying at the end of this year, it's 130 years since South Australia made history by becoming the first place in the world to grant women both full suffrage and the right to stand for Parliament. It's a very significant and powerful achievement. And it's my great pleasure to be here this evening as part of this panel focusing on Irish women in South Australia around that time, who challenged the existing power structures even when they were ostensibly powerless. And I'm going to focus, as Kiera has said, on the Irish women who lived at Baker's Flat and how they exercised power in some unorthodox ways. So first of all, a little bit of background. So Baker's Flat is located near Kapunda, about 75 kilometres north of Adelaide. And today, this is what it looks like. So a paddock, a sheep paddock, used alternatively for farming sheep and wheat. And the only signs that it may have been the site of a long-standing and substantial community are the ceramic and glass fragments that can still be found scattered on the surface, and the occasional piles of stone rubble next to a pepper tree, a classic marker in Australia of 19th century colonisation. So, just a quick recap of a few pertinent facts as I see them about the colony of South Australia. Firstly, it was deliberately designed to replicate a slice of England in the Antipodes. So it was based on a scheme, the Wakefield scheme, where already wealthy men could increase their wealth merely by buying land and waiting for it to increase in value, a utopia for land speculators and capitalists. Secondly, into this heady mix of largely English money and speculation came small numbers of poor Irish Catholics. Very small numbers, because South Australia was well known for its antipathy towards Catholics, especially if they were poor and especially if they were Irish. So, for example, in 1848, David McLaren, he was the manager of the South Australian Company until 1841. He was back in England by 1848, and he was making a statement to a House of Lords Select Committee about emigration to South Australia. He said that based on his experience of the Irish emigrants already in South Australia, he considered them as very little removed from the mere animal. So invariably, Irish Catholics were described as ignorant, lazy, dirty, stupid. But in 1854, some of these Irish Catholics arrived at Kapunda, and they were seeking work in the booming copper mine, which had been in operation for about a decade and needed lots of labour. So the Irish settled on a large parcel of land that was then lying idle and unused by the legal owners. This was very convenient because it was close to the mine and it was rent-free. And there's a lot of evidence as well that that the owners of the mine were very happy in consultation with the legal landowners to allow the Irish to be here, close as a very nearby workforce, for as long as the mine was needing labour. This land was known as Baker's Flat, and the Irish took it under their full control, even though they were essentially illegal occupiers. They quickly formed what was described as a fierce, close, fiercely Irish community. So during the period that the mine was in high operations around the 1860s and 1870s, there were about 500 people living on Baker's Flat. And they had a very strong Irish identity. So they built houses that looked like Irish houses. So you can see the houses on the screen. They're a depiction from a group of photographs that were taken in 1906 of houses remaining on Baker's Flat. And you can see how strongly Irish they look. They look like they've been lifted out of the west of Ireland and then plonked down in a field in South Australia. So the people of Baker's Flat had a very strong Catholic faith. They used to walk a number of kilometres across a ford and up a hill to the church at St. John's, about 5 kilometres away every Sunday, after which there were tales of men trying to move a very large rock while they waited to smoke their pipes and get the newspaper from the local shop. They danced to Irish music by firelight on a common area known as the dance floor. And this dance floor, when we did geophysical surveys over that particular point, was still compacted from the thousands of feet that had danced and played hurling and so on in that area for many, many years. Because they played hurling, allegedly the fastest sport in the world, on Sunday afternoons, after they'd got back from moving the big rock. The settlement was located on contested land, however. It was legally owned by a consortium of powerful men, including names that we still remember today in pastoral companies, libraries, big houses, political electorates. So men like Thomas Elder, Robert Barr Smith, Samuel Davenport, they were all part of the consortium that owned the land legally. But the Irish residents were as certain about their rights to Baker's Flat as the legal landowners were about theirs. And in the late 19th century, it became the scene of disputes and conflict that went on for decades. So attempted evictions from Baker's Flat started in the late 1870s, coincided with the downturn and closure of the mine. And so one is captured here in a mural that has been shown until recently in Kapunda, and it's now in storage. But you can see this group of Irish women, feisty Irish women, seeing off bailiffs and the police with brooms and sticks and pots of boiling water. This was not unusual on Baker's Flat, especially women being at the forefront of the resistance. And it's very reminiscent of the land war that was happening around the same time back in Ireland. So during the land war, women were essential to the protests and the agitation. They taunted the bailiffs. They threw mud and stones at the police. They blocked roadways with their bodies. And notably, even when there were men present, the women still took the lead. And these were deliberate strategies. I mean, often it was said that because if the women were arrested, the police would go easier on them than if they had arrested the men. And also if the men were arrested, the breadwinner was then gone for the time they were in prison. So it was easier if the women were at the forefront. But the same thing was happening on Baker's Flat as was happening back in Ireland. And the Irish Land War was very well covered in the South Australian press. So using the same tactics. The names of these women, though, the women involved in these particular disputes, are lost to time. Their names were not printed in the newspapers, even though at that point court cases were often reported verbatim. Instead, they are referred to as a band of females or a mob of ladies. As an aside, it's often the powerless who are unnamed in these reports, the women, the shepherd, and so on, who would have come to do things. The names of the landowners like James White or the police constable Grant, they are often used frequently. So on we go to 1880, when 3 unfortunate men were sent by the legal landowners to erect a fence on Baker's Flat. This was a tactic that under the Real Property Act would help to establish their ownership. And the women were having none of it. Up to 100 of them turned out to drive off the would-be despoilers of their hearths and homes. The perplexed men were determined manfully to do their duty, and they started to dig a hole for the first fence post. At this point, they were able to withstand the jeers and the taunts from the crowd, but when one of the women struck one of the fencers on the head, things changed. This woman then leapt into the partially excavated post hole, declaring that any further excavation would have to be through her body. So, 3 men went into a huddle. After a bit of discussion, they wisely decided to retreat, and they were sent on their way smartly by the women, as usual, using brooms, sticks and shovels, described in the newspaper account as leaving the fair army in triumphant possession of the field. Of the 100 women active on this battlefield, 6 were named in the subsequent court case, along with others who were called as witnesses, and this has allowed me to explore their lives in more detail. So, the 1886, I call them. The 6 ringleaders were named as Anne Slattery, Mary Callahan, Mary Lacey, Mary Josie, Anne Hoare, and Catherine Driscoll. And although the outcome of the fencing dispute was not reported in the newspapers, it appears that their determined resistance resulted in the fencing task being abandoned and the legal landowners retiring to lick their wounds because the community lived in relative peace for about a decade afterwards. These are the only photos I've been able to track down so far of the women, but we can find out a little bit more about each of them. So, 2 of the women, Catherine Driscoll in the left, and Mary Lacey, and one of the witnesses, Arthure Driscoll, were directly connected through the Driscoll family, who were major players in the Baker's Flat community. So Daniel Driscoll was the de facto spokesperson and leader of the settlement, and Catherine was married to Daniel's cousin Patrick, and at the time of the court case, she was 36 years old. Over the course of her life, she would go on to have 11 children, and her name made the papers again the following year when Margaret Simpson, another Baker's Flat resident, was obliged to apologise to her for statements made that were injurious to her character. I always wonder if that was maybe a reference to her exploits on the battlefield the year before. The photograph of Catherine, taken in her later years, shows her in profile. So according to the family history, she always took this position during photographs, deliberately to hide a disfigurement, because apparently she stopped to talk to a boy after Mass. He threw a stone at her and took her eye out. I do wonder if maybe she didn't talk to the boy, as maybe shout at him, but anyway, still. So Mary Lacey, who was born a Driscoll, was Catherine's sister-in-law. Mary was married to Martin, and based on her children's birth records, she would have been about 30 years of age in 1880, and she would go on to have 12 children in total. And Arthure Driscoll, who was a witness in the case and was also at the battle, was an older woman. She was Catherine's mother-in-law and Mary's mother. The 3 women had sailed to South Australia on the same vessel, the Tarquin, in 1864, and sisters-in-law Mary Lacey and Catherine Driscoll were close in age. So Arthure was born either Anne Hogan or Anne McNamara, because the records are unclear about that. At the time of the court case in 1880, she was 55 years old, and she was married to Patrick. In 1864, there'd been a family tragedy, so the family had tragically lost their daughter Amelia when her dress caught fire in a candle. Amelia was at home with her 6 siblings while their parents went out to visit relatives in a nearby house. And 4 of the children were in bed, the remaining 3 were reading around the table. Amelia turned around, the candle caught her dress, and she received terrible burns, dying within 12 hours. This 10-year-old Amelia, who was a witness for the case, she must have been born in 1870 and possibly named for her dead sister. So Anne and her family continued to live on Baker's Flat until her sudden death 12 years later in 1892, when she was 67 years old. She was sitting with Patrick at the door of their house. She suddenly fell forward, apparently dying, and all efforts failed to rally her. A year later, her daughter, Mary Catherine Fleet, placed a notice in the paper in loving remembrance of her mother. So then, the 3 remaining women, Anne Slattery, Mary Callaghan and Mary Josie. There's little information available about Anne Slattery except that she was 54 years old at the time of the court case and had been widowed for 9 years. Sadly, she was going to die the following year on a wintry Sunday morning after complaining of a pain in her side. The court reports place her with Mary Callaghan, and it was Mary Callaghan allegedly, who sat in the hole and declared that further excavations would have to be through her body. Mary was also reported to be carrying a good-sized stick, although Mrs. Callaghan also had a stick in her hand. That was Mrs. Callaghan, Mary Callaghan. Now, Mary was probably only 19 years old at the time. She was married to James Callaghan, and they had been married 3 years earlier at Kapunda when she was 16 and he was 22. In 1882, they had a son, Joseph Henry. Mary then went on to have 6 further children with a different man, Michael John Colbert. And based on the death record for James Callaghan, her husband, it appears that he left Mary and their child. And maybe then Mary couldn't marry Michael because she was still married to James, and as a result, her children from this relationship would have been declared illegitimate. But all the children are listed twice on separate registers, one for Colbert, one for Callaghan, 4 daughters and 2 sons. So Mary Josie, her family name before marriage was McInerney, and this was also a family that had many, many members on Baker's Flat. She married William Josie in 1861 at the local parish church when she was 32 years of age. By the time of the 1880 dispute, she would have been 51, although there are some discrepancies in her death certificate, and she may have been 59. There's no evidence of any children in the church or state records, and the only other occasion that Mary is featured in the papers is 4 years later in 1885, when Owen Harrison was charged with willfully damaging her house, for which he was sentenced to 2 months hard labour. So having names for the 6 women charged in the 1880 case enables a fuller picture to be painted of their lives. And this is a privilege that the unnamed women in earlier cases do not have. They'd all married, some had children, some had already survived tragedy or would go on to face further challenges. The fact that 3 of the 6 were related through birth or marriage hints that the Driscoll family's influence may have played a part in the protest. The Driscolls were very influential in the Baker's Flat community, and they were very focused on all of the people at Baker's Flat having stable and continued access to the land. And what do these stories tell us about the Irish women of Baker's Flat? They were living in this remote corner of South Australia, yet employed the same tactics as were being used in the Irish Land War. And this was the same thing that female protesters across Ireland and Europe were doing throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Given the family correspondence that went back and forth between Australia and Ireland, and the news from Ireland available in the South Australian newspapers, it's likely that they were very well aware of the battle for land rights back home and were able to adapt these strategies for their own needs. So, Catherine Driscoll, Mary Lacey, Arthure, Anne Slattery, Mary Callaghan, Mary Josie, are now named and remembered, as is the resistance demonstrated by the greater group of Baker's Flat women. These women, remember, were up against some of the richest and most powerful men in the colony. They had probably already experienced or witnessed injustice and the abuse of power by men with power and status. They knew that a thing being lawful didn't necessarily mean that it was right. They were prepared to rage and resist as they saw fit. And I think that naming the women and telling their stories looks to redress some of the power imbalance, because I firmly believe that naming brings its own power. Thank you.
Wasn't that fantastic? So Susan is one of, as well as the contributor with a chapter in the book Irish Women in the Antipodes. She's also one of 4 editors of that collection, and it's published by Wakefield Press. If you haven't got a copy, go and get one, because it's a really cracking book, beautifully written. It's fair to say that many of the Irish women in that collection had a way with words as well as actions. Indeed, one of the things that I was most struck about with the book is the effort that each author took to mine the archives to represent the distinctive voices of the women that they were writing about. In some instances, that has been almost impossible. And the only way to do it is through records that were created by men. Newspaper reporters, court reporters, judges, policemen. But this is certainly not the case with our next subject, the indomitable Mary Lee. Mary is undoubtedly the most famous woman in this collection, precisely because she not only dared to take her stand upon a public stage, but she also demanded to be heard and learnt the skills to be heard. As Denise George is going to share with us, Lee was not only condemned as a turbulent anarchist for so doing, but repeatedly ridiculed for fretting and foaming, stewing and scolding. Fretting and foaming, stewing and scolding. It's fantastic, isn't it? Nonetheless, Mary persisted with a spirit of tenacity that inspires us, I would hope, to do the same. That is, to converse like Mary did, to forge networks and friendships, and to speak up against justice and be heard. So let us allow Denise to be heard. For Denise has an incredible background. She studied professional writing and communication. She has a PhD in English and creative writing from the University of Adelaide. She has a passion for the extraordinary stories of the seemingly ordinary South Australian characters, with a focus on historical narrative non-fiction. She's the author of Mary Lee, The Life and Times of a Turbulent Anarchist, and her battle for women's rights with Wakefield Press again. Wakefield Press, what heroes they are. We really need to support Wakefield Press as much as we can. Denise also undertook her research in Adelaide, Ireland and England to reveal the compelling story of how Mary Lee took on the South Australian establishment, and like the women of Kapunda, she won. Please welcome Denise to the stage.
Here we are. There's the lady, Mary Lee. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction and for that absolutely fascinating talk. And while I was sitting there listening, I realised that a lot of the work that Mary Lee did was at the same time that the women that you're talking about were actually very, very active. But Mary Lee took a very different approach, as you'll discover. Thank you, firstly, for coming along this evening. It's late at night, and you've done very well.
As long as you stay.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, a little bit further to go yet. Firstly, I'd like to say that I take great pleasure in having the opportunity to share my research and my reflections about Mary Lee. I first came across Mary Lee. I'm not a historian, I'm an imposter in that regard, But during some of my other studies, I came across her name. I was, I think, writing an essay about Adelaide, city of Adelaide, came across her name, had never heard of her, knew absolutely nothing about women's suffrage, and really thought, I might start having a bit of a look around. She sounds pretty interesting. And that's what I did. I had come across some work by the late Helen Jones, who had started writing about Mary Lee, along with some other historians during that 1980s period. And she had identified Mary Lee as a key player in the women's suffrage movement here in South Australia. But as I mentioned, I had never heard of her. So I went looking for information and very quickly realised that because of the absence of her journals, the story is that her diaries were thrown into the Brompton Bog, which was a dump, after she died, so that they were all gone. There is a shortage of recorded colonial history, has already indicated by Susan. And also, it's very difficult to, over that period of time, apart from some of the newspapers and things, it was very difficult for me to find any information. However, it was really that lack of presence that sent me on this trajectory that really became a labour of love, and that took me basically across around the world to see whether I could find out more. And I have ever since walked around with Mary Lee on my mind and in my heart, and she really, her story is the gift that keeps on giving. She's done it for me, and I think she does it for lots of other people who discover her in time, as they have. Mary Lee successfully navigated one of the most significant and controversial reforms in women's political history. And this year, as Kiera mentioned, we celebrate the 130th anniversary. So, who was Mary Lee? Mary was born into a working-class Protestant family in County Monaghan, Ireland on St Valentine's Day, 1821. Her father, John Walsh, was master of the local Orange Lodge. She gained an education which was highly unusual for young Irish girls at that period of time. She trained as a school teacher and eventually married a man by the name of George Lee from the prominent Amar musical family nearby to County Monaghan. The catastrophic Irish potato famine of the autumn 1845, which most of you, I'm sure, are more than familiar with, brought starvation, disease, poverty and death. The Amar workhouse, built to accommodate 1,000 paupers at that time, reached its quota by mid-December the following year. County fever hospitals couldn't cope. Soup kitchens set up by poor law unions were inadequate. Families barricaded themselves into their homes and starved to death. And I think it's estimated that 1 million people died during that period. It left a grieving population, crushed, disillusioned, angry and extremely resentful. They were desperate times. And these desperate times gave rise to many enlightened Irish women who wrote prose and poetry and used their pen as a peaceful weapon, unlike the women of Baker's Flat, against oppression. Women grew vocal at public meetings. They joined in the protests. They wrote letters to the press. And this was at a period of time where women were actively discouraged from doing any such thing. It was taboo, extremely bad form for women to get up and speak in public. We take it for granted today and don't give it a second thought. But they were many of the same disobedient tactics adopted by Mary Lee in the years that followed. Mary and George eventually left Ireland in the early 1850s, and they settled in a small village called Barnwell, which was part of Cambridge in England. And the little village was regarded as a labyrinth of hovels of petty crime and poverty. And it was here that George had also trained as a school teacher. So both George and Mary were teaching at the local national school. And I think what that indicates is the importance that education meant for Mary, and she took the importance of education with her in terms of looking at the rights for women because she knew it was integral to their development. Mary gave birth to 7 children and shared the responsibility of working and her family with George, and they were, from all accounts, a quite devoted couple. They moved to, after 10 years in Barnwell, they moved to Hammersmith after a decade, and it was here that Mary set up her first private girls' school in the family home. And again, she knew that young girls were being disadvantaged in terms of education. It was very common for young boys to find education, to have schools provided. It was less available to young girls. Unfortunately, George died in the 1860s, and Mary moved to an area called Belsize Park Gardens, which was near Hampstead Heath, which was quite a step up. Mary was born working class, remained working class, had to work her entire life. Even though she was educated, I think a lot of people regarded her as middle class. That wasn't the case. She always had to work to earn a living. And she became the sole breadwinner once George had passed away. And it was in Hampstead Heath that she established her second private girls' school in the family home, and I've been to the family home. It's a sort of 4-storey Regency building, a really beautiful building. She lived there with a number of her near adult children at this point and took in something like 23 young girls from all over the world to live and be educated in the home. Now, by this time, Mary had survived the Great Potato Famine. She had married, she had left her Irish homeland, she had moved to England, bore 7 children, developed a demanding career, established a number of businesses, suffered the death at this point of several of her children, and become a widow, which, I mean, in today, that's a fairly heavy load. During this period, it was extremely difficult. So she had done extremely well. And for the first time in her life, I do believe she was experiencing a period of relative calm. Things had started to settle down, only it was not to last, unfortunately. In 1879, Mary departed for Adelaide with her eldest daughter, Evelyn. Mary's youngest son, who was 21 at the time, John Benjamin, had sailed to South Australia the previous year and contracted tuberculosis. And tuberculosis during this period was rampant in Adelaide. No one paid much attention to the diminutive 59-year-old widow and her daughter standing on the wharf sweltering in the South Australian heat. In time, Mary Lee would be recognised wherever she went. Unfortunately, Mary's son Ben died within the year. And in the depths of grief, Mary could have sought solace in a quiet life. But of course, she did no such thing. She joined the Wellington Square Primitive Methodist Church, North Adelaide. The building is still there on the corner of Wellington Square and Tint Street. A beautiful building. And she lived for 20 years in a home in Bernard Street. And so that was her local precinct. She used to walk across Wellington Square to the church. She lived there for 20 years and attended the church there. And it was here that the Reverend Hugh Gilmore encouraged his congregation to embrace not only religion but social justice. He encouraged his congregation to go into the streets of Adelaide and to look after the poor, to share their time and whatever affluence they had with the poor. She also joined the Norwood Female Refuge, and it was here that she would make her way around the streets of Adelaide and discovered that young girls from both Ireland and England were living in dire conditions with no means of support. And a lot of these young girls had been brought out through different schemes to, to marry young South Australian men and also to work as domestic servants. And of course, some of them didn't gain work. Sometimes the positions were just disgusting and dreadful, and they ended up living on the streets and needed support from groups like those attended by Mary. She joined another organisation called the Social Purity Society, established by the Reverend Joseph Coles Kirby, who some of you may have also heard of. Now, together they successfully lobbied Parliament to raise the age of consent from what it was at the time, 13, to 15 years of age. So these are young girls who were really being taken advantage of as sex workers. And so it was really the increase in the age of consent that was hopefully would set up a preventative measure. Kirby later claimed that the Act was achieved principally through the work of Mary Lee. Eventually, Mary realised, and Mary was an extremely religious woman, and there are many quotes from her writings related to her faith and her belief in God. However, she also realised that no amount of charity and prayer was going to improve the lives of the women in colonial Adelaide. She believed that the solution to poverty and injustice was dependent on educational and legislative reform, and a lot of her work that she had done in the education system had taught her that, and of course she was right. Men had been granted the right to vote in South Australia as early as 1856. However, men convicted of treason or any other crime, non-English subjects, and all women were excluded from voting on election day. Women had few rights, if any, pertaining to their finances, to education, marriage, guardianship, citizenship, and suffrage. In 1885, South Australian politician Edward Sterling put the first women's suffrage motion before Parliament. I believe it would one day be thought incredible, he proclaimed, that there was ever a time when the idea of giving votes to women was regarded as dangerous or revolutionary, something we today take for granted. Now, Sterling was probably the right guy to put this motion up. He had returned recently from Britain. He had spent time with quite militant suffragettes in London, and he also had 5 daughters. So he knew that there was a need. And it's worth mentioning that the suffragettes, both in Britain and America, were extremely militant. The suffragists, as they were known here in South Australia, took quite a different tact. They never chained themselves to the Houses of Parliament. They didn't really even have marches as such. They were never arrested, I don't think on any account that I'm aware of. But they did hold lots of rallies, lots of meetings. They did lots of marketing. And it worked. Mary was appointed Secretary of the Women's Suffrage League, and in doing so removed the mantle of respectability and silence and began a journey of social and civil disobedience under the gaze of a society that was not prepared for the likes of her. And the Women's Suffrage League was formed after Sterling had put this initial motion up in Parliament. Prior to that, there was no group in South Australia who in support of women's suffrage. And Mary was aware, along with other women at the time, that it was required that there was an organisation that needed to educate the general public and also to encourage women and men to join the cause. The other thing that was needed was that they required a group to lobby Parliament because they knew that this was going to take a while, and there was a great deal of resistance to the suffrage. Mary eventually developed confidence over time. She wasn't always a confident public speaker, believe it or not, because she grew very confident eventually, and they actually couldn't shut her up on a number of occasions. She was told to be quiet. But in time, she became the loud and relentless voice of women's suffrage. She wrote to the press asking Adelaide women to join the cause. "Let us be up and doing. This has been called a women's century, and it is hastening to a close. Let us women of South Australia pledge ourselves to make its last page its brightest. Let us shrink from no service, however hard or humiliating. We must give no advantage to our antagonists. The interests of our country demand our effort. The interests of our children demand it. Let the responsibility be ours. And she continually called for the women of Adelaide and also around Australia to join the cause. The anti-suffrage backlash was immediate, and as the face and voice of suffrage, much of it was directed at the then 67-year-old Mary Lee. On one occasion, she was attacked by a staunch anti-suffrage campaigner, the Honourable Henry Hussey, who claimed, if Mary Lee is a typical example of what we may expect if females generally attain universal suffrage, I am afraid the world would not be much improved by the change. Let Mary Lee follow the noble example of many of her sex who are too modest and refined to wrangle publicly in the press. She was chastised and abused for lecturing on the Sabbath and criticised for speaking in public. And at that period of time, there was no work done on the Sabbath. So public speaking was abhorrent to lots of people, not to Mary Lee, of course. One speaker criticised her. Mrs. Lee has thrust herself into the walks of men, and my chivalry in respect to her is dead, wrote one young South Australian. I hope Mrs. Lee will forgive me indicating that in my youthful opinion, she is a turbulent anarchist. The turbulent anarchist, here we are. Anti-Irish stereotypes were fostered by politicians, press commentators and the community long before Mary ever set foot on South Australian soil, as Susan has already accentuated. News of political unrest followed the Irish to Australia, and they were in some instances judged as political agitators. One Adelaide resident remarked that even in the present state of this colony, with the proportion of Irish now amongst us, and without further additions, the Irish animus is by far too prevalent. This is disgusting. Disgusting caricatures and uncomplimentary, heavy, masculine jawline and beady eyes denigrating older Irish women were prevalent also in the press. Commonplace advertisements for domestic servants specified no Irish need apply. Now, while that's going on, and Mary's involved with the suffrage movement, she also grew very concerned about the poor working conditions of women in Adelaide, especially the hub of cheap labour in the garment industry. And it was here she discovered, and she was working with a woman called Augustus Adol, and they would visit the factories and very quickly established that the women were being underpaid, they were working in disgusting conditions, and they were being exploited in every way. Now, the United Trades and Labour Council, the first of its kind outside of Britain, comprised entirely of men, was formed in South Australia in 1884. Mary demanded that this United Trades and Labour Council form a female trade union in all branches of industry where the sweating system existed. And she was elected secretary of the first women's working trade union established a few weeks later. Now, Mary navigated the Women's Suffrage League through a storm of antagonism from conservative politicians and a hostile public during the controversial 9-year campaign. Bullying tactics and intimidation against women that still persist in Parliament today. The Constitution Female Suffrage Act was passed on the 18th of December 1894. It granted women the right to vote and the right to stand as members of Parliament. Now, it made the women of South Australia the only fully franchised women in the world. The year previous, the women of New Zealand had been granted the right to vote, much to Mary's disgust, by the way. However, they were not given the right to stand as members of Parliament, and that's what makes this dual right to vote and stand as members of Parliament is what makes the South Australian legislation so unique. Mary Lee and Catherine Helen Spence, who you're probably more aware of, were both nominated for seats in the Legislative Council, the highest political position ever offered to women at the time. Mary, I'm not quite sure what Spence ended up doing. Mary declined the offer. She was not interested in party politics, and she was determined to continue her social justice work. Unfortunately, the battle for gender equality was only part of the equation. Racial injustice was later enshrined in the Commonwealth Franchise Act 1902, which denied voting rights to any Aboriginal native of Australia, Asia, Africa, or the islands of the Pacific, except New Zealand. It took another 60 years for First Nation people to gain the right to vote in 1962. And it should be mentioned that the right to vote for women in 1894 was for all women, First Nation and European at that time. To put South Australian legislation 1 in 1894 into perspective in regards to other women around the world, the United States didn't win the right to vote until 1920. As militant as they were, it took another quarter of a century after South Australia. In France, it was 1944. In India, it was 1950. In Switzerland, it was 1971. And in Saudi Arabia, it was 2011 that women got the right to vote. Mary eventually relinquished the reins of the Women's Suffrage League, but she did not go quietly, as we can expect. She spent her remaining years at the forefront of other battles for social justice here in Adelaide. She was appointed the first and only volunteer female visitor to what were then known as the Adelaide and Parkside lunatic asylums in 1896. And at that period, they would burn rubbish on the grounds of the lunatic asylums. And the rooms and corridors would fill up with black smoke. So Mary wrote to Parliament saying it was disgusting. There were no floor coverings, it was freezing cold. She was the only one, and I've actually cited the visitors' book for the lunatic asylums, she was the only one that would actually make comment. And the other visitors, and these visitors were appointed, generally men, apart from Mary, to visit the asylums and to make comment to Parliament. Most of them just put a signature in the book. It was only Mary who actually complained. She did other things too. She demanded leniency for men awaiting execution on death row at the Adelaide jail. She was against the death penalty on religious grounds. She supported the abolition of bans on public beaches by minors. And at this period of time, which I couldn't even believe, young children were banned on swimming on metropolitan beaches by certain people in the community, believe it or not. She was against South Australian soldiers going to the Boer War, and she wrote to the press and drew attention to the fact that she didn't like the idea, after which a bitter anti-Irish tirade was immediately levelled at her in the press. A list should be taken of all openly disloyal and traitorous individuals, wrote one South Australian reader. Next, it should be regarded as only a just punishment that these should be practically boycotted by loyal British subjects. We should get them on a list, for they should never be missed. And went on to say, what is truly revolting is the venomous spite and hatred ventilated through the press by renegade English or by the Irish of the wrong sort, the Mary Lee kind, end of quote. Unfortunately, Mary eventually became one of the many poverty-stricken women she had fought her entire life to protect. She contracted influenza and passed away in September 1909, just short of her 90th birthday. It was a quiet end for a woman who had demanded to be heard. Mary Lee was almost 60 years old when she arrived in South Australia and embarked on a 30-year battle for justice against vigorous antagonism. The passionate social conscience that had begun as a flickering flame in the cobbled streets of Amar burned brightly to light the way for women in the Australian colony. She never held high office and had a title before her name or initials after it. Nonetheless, today, Mary Lee is remembered as one of the most contrary, determined and successful social and political advocates of her generation, who spent her entire life harnessing the power of human spirit to change the course of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Mary Lee, I feel like we should have a moment just to say thank you to Mary Lee. So beleaguered and misunderstood in her time, but what a contribution! And not only to South Australia, but to the world and to our hearts. Does anyone listen to the History Extra podcast? Hands up for anyone who listens to it. Just one other person in the room. Well, at the moment, they've got a series of podcasts called Deeds Not Words, and they're about the suffragist movement in England. And their opening episode, 6-part series, talks about the background of the move for women to get the vote. And they jumped from New Zealand to England. They didn't even mention South Australia. So if anybody wants to join me in a little bit of advocating for South Australian history, I'm going to write to the producers of that series and give them a bit of what for in the spirit of Mary Lee. So please let me know if you're interested in joining that, because I think we've got to make sure that the South Australian story is known by people abroad. They have no right to jump from New Zealand and forget us completely. So tonight we're going to conclude with the story of a very different Irish woman, but from the same time period, the incorrigible rogue and vagabond, Bridget Fitzgerald O'Hara. She came to Adelaide from Ireland in the 1870s. This chapter in the book was co-authored by Anita Stelmark and Stephanie James, who can't be here. But very sadly, neither of them can be. Anita is overseas, while, as we know, Stephanie is unwell tonight. But we're so grateful to Susan for stepping in to share Bridget's stories, as I have to say, it provides us with a critical insight into the way that informal networks also sustained 19th century Irish women who were condemned for their easy virtue and intemperate habits, who struggled with criminality, alcoholism and institutionalisations and lived well beyond the margins of respectable society. Although often acknowledged, I think it's really important to remember that these women actually also played a role in the movement for women's rights in the 19th century, because their lives, their experience on the streets, their very precarity of their existence inspired movements like the Social Purity Society that eventually led on to the women's suffrage movement here. So, in a sense, Bridget is part of that story, those networks too. I think we often think about the past as places where one class is over here and another class is over there, but this is a society, a dynamic, moving, engaged society, as Mary Lee's life tells us. So tonight we're going to learn about the red-haired Bridget Fitzgerald O'Hara, who often expressed a defiant sense of self that was deeply entwined with what it meant to be Irish in 19th century South Australia. In her lifetime, Bridget clocked up some 200 or so convictions and even boasted about her criminality in ways that seemed empowering for her. For example, when she was arrested outside the Colonel Lights Hotel one evening in August 1902, she showed no fear in taking the fight to the police, warning them, as she told the judge a few days later, that it would take at least 3 of them to bring me down, before proudly declaring, "Gingers for pluck, bagorra. It takes 3 of you to bring me down." And then she flung her straw hat across the court in defiance. I love Bridget, and I'm so excited that we get to share her story tonight, especially because it's a story that takes us into 19th century streets of Adelaide in a way that we might not often imagine. Streets like Hindley Street and around Hindley Square, etc., in a way that I think is important to think about the women's story. So although Stephanie's not here tonight, and Susan's presenting, I think it's important to still acknowledge Stephanie's work. That she has a PhD in history, and I love this too, right? Tonight we have an archaeologist, we have a creative writer, and we have a historian on stage, because engaging with history, the past, is an interdisciplinary practice. So Stephanie's our historian, here in absence. And she holds a PhD in history at Flinders as well as adjunct status there. Her own strong Irish background has propelled her interest in the Irish in South Australia. Her MA focused on the Clare Valley Irish and the area that emerged as the colony's most Irish region in the 1861 census. Exploring aspects of Irish Australian responses to the imperial crisis provided the platform for her PhD. Stephanie's contribution on the Irish also appeals in the second edition of the Wakefield Companion to South Australian History, which was launched during the History Festival, so go and get your copy of that as well. The challenges of locating the female Irish voice and experience remains a critical factor in Stephanie's research. So please welcome Susan and thank her again for telling Stephanie's and Bridget's story.
Thanks, Kiera, and I know you really like this chapter, and I'm very conscious I'm not Stephanie, but I'm trying to channel Stephanie, so I'll try and do you both proud.
Channel Bridget too.
I'll channel Bridget as well. In fact, she's got a lot of pluck, so yes. So the chapter that Stephanie and Anita wrote is called Bridget Fitzgerald O'Hara, a criminalised daughter of Erin, 1857 to we don't know when, because we don't actually know her date of death. And looking at powerless as without power or authority in relation to this particular chapter, this view of powerlessness might not necessarily apply to Bridget, because she couldn't easily be described as powerful in the way that Mary Lee was in sort of advocating for change. And even indeed in the case of the women of Baker's Flat, who just got out with their sticks and shovels. But Stephanie suggests that as we have located and documented the fragments of her life and shared them, that this very process of sharing them in its own way gives Bridget Fitzgerald O'Hara some retrospective power. So tonight I'm going to tell you about Bridget's life in answer to 3 questions. What aspects of Bridget's colonial life are we sure of? What do we probably know about her colonial life? And what do we not know about her life in South Australia? So firstly, the certainties. And many of these come from the record keeping maintained by police and the justice system, including prisons. There are also hospital records, although these reflect some ambiguities about Bridget. And beyond their informative value, these records tend to be limited, unlike newspaper coverage of some of Bridget's court appearances, which provides more detail, and the accounts are much more colourful and nuanced. For example, as Kiera has already referenced, the Register's December 1902 comment about Bridget showing her contempt for the ways of the law by sending a dilapidated old straw hat flying into the court. So we know that Bridget had health issues. A Bridget Flannery, which was her maiden name, was admitted to the Destitute Asylum as an emergency in the first year that she arrived in South Australia, 1878. And she was later in the Adelaide hospital, mostly for alcohol-related issues, 8 times, 1889, 99, 1907, 1911, twice in both 1913 and 1920. And in 1894, when she was already in jail, she was admitted to hospital for an infected tooth, and the record suggests that this was possibly for as long as 14 days. So we do know also that in December 1884, a prostitute was charged for assaulting Bridget, and more seriously, in August 1885, a 17-year-old youth was committed for raping her. But at the trial, police gave evidence of her easy virtue and her intemperate habits. And this, in addition to Bridget acknowledging that she had not lived with her husband for 3 years, helped to persuade the jury, despite witness evidence, and the case was dismissed. So we know Bridget was married twice, to Irishman John Fitzgerald in 1879 and to Scotsman James O'Hara in 1912. Although she was first described in police reports as a widow in 1899, the most likely year that John Fitzgerald died was 1909, because he's recorded then as dying of stomach cancer and heart failure. But both of her marriages took place at the same church, St. Patrick's in Grove Street. And this was the most important church for the West End Irish community. So Bridget and her first husband, John Fitzgerald, parted quite soon after their marriage, and her single status probably led to her first conviction in 1881. But some contact was maintained between them. They were arrested together on 4 occasions, and the item on the screen highlights their 1894 court appearance. Bridget and James O'Hara, the Scotsman, were associates in crime from 1896. So the pair were arrested at Mount Barker. This was the first arrest of them both together. Bridget for both willful damage and indecent language. James only for indecent language. Perhaps he wasn't brave enough for the willful damage. So we also know that Bridget and James travelled outside Adelaide, possibly by train. In 1896, they were in Mount Barker and Gawler. In 1899, they went to Goolwa, the Burra area in 1907, Murray Bridge and Yorktown in 1910, Port Pirie in 1916, and Gladstone in 1917. So it was almost like a Cook's tour of South Australia. Now, we don't know where she actually lived, but most of her arrests were in the city, particularly the West End. In 1910, she was arrested in both Norwood and Glynde, at Victoria Park in 1911, and in Norwood in 1913. And we know that the inebriates register for the Adelaide jail recorded 265 convictions for Bridget in the 41 years from February 1881. Her last arrest was in September 1922. The arrests included 99 charges of drunkenness and 66 of indecent language, and the two were combined on 43 occasions. And I did a quick calculation, and if she hadn't been in jail, this was sort of averaging 6.5 convictions a year. So that's like one every 2 months, isn't it? My maths is terrible. Yes. But given that she was in jail for probably half the time that she was here, I mean, she was actually averaging like a conviction a month, which is pretty impressive. So, as a direct consequence of the 1914 Convicted Inebriates Act targeted at habitual drunkards, including women convicted of drunkenness 3 times in any 12-month period, in 1914, Bridget was sent from the Adelaide jail to the Gladstone Inebriates Institution, which was only opened in that year. She was there again in October 1918 and also in March 1921. So the average stay at Gladstone was 16 months. Prisoners were then released on licence, and reoffending could return them straight away to prison. So there wasn't really much attempt at rehabilitation for any of these inmates. So we know that Bridget damaged prison property on 4 occasions, blankets, for example, as well as damaging public property, mainly window smashing. She was charged on 22 occasions for malicious damage, and between 1899 and 1903, she was arrested 3 times for larceny. So we know that she was a proud woman. She was proud of her record. She was proud of her red hair. She was proud of being Irish. Sometimes her Irish expressions were quoted. So as Kiera had indicated as well, she boasted in the courtroom, Ginger, this is Ginger, her red hair, Ginger is for pluck. Begorra, it takes 3 of your constables to down me. And at one memorable arrest for drunkenness, she refused to walk with the constable and she requested a carriage. "You spelt bean, do you think I'm going to walk? I'm a lady and I won't move a step without a carriage." And then she dropped to the road and threatened to kick, bite and scratch anyone who attempted to touch her. They did order her a carriage. She couldn't pay the fee. She was fined. And she said, "It might as well be £150 because I can't afford it anyway. You can just send me to prison." So we know she was charged in both 1892 and 1893 with assaulting police and in 1894 with the assault of a Mrs. Sidney. But there's no other evidence of Bridget being violent towards individuals. We also know that her visit to the Blacks camp in March 1898 was judged as a clear social transgression. So secondly, what do we probably know about Bridget? We know that she was probably born in County Clare to James Flannery and Mary Carty in December 1857. And County Clare, you probably maybe know, provided the largest number of Irish immigrants to South Australia. She probably arrived on the Rodney in late November 1877. Although she wasn't listed on the passenger list, she was probably one of the single women among the 229 Irish immigrant passengers. Her records consistently refer to this ship. And while we do not actually know why she came to the colony, these years between 1876 and 1878 coincided with a surge in female Irish immigration. We also know she was associated and arrested with other prostitutes on a number of occasions. Susan Kane in 1894, 96, 1904 and 05, and Laura Lindsey in 1899 and 1902. But it's unclear whether this association also constituted friendship. So both Bridget and her second husband, James O'Hara, were resident in the McGill Old Folks Home, which opened in 1917. But we don't know exactly when or for how long, and there are no photographs where we can actually identify Bridget. But we also know that, or surmise, that the level of supervision and the prohibition of alcohol at the Old Folks Home would not have suited either Bridget's lifestyle or James's. So we can gauge some details about her appearance, although we have no photographs. An 1886 newspaper item described her as an elderly-looking woman. In the Police Gazette of 1893, she had hazel eyes and her hair was reddish-brown. But by 1912, she was withered and elderly. Her final mention in 1923 noted she was 5 foot 1 inches tall, with a small build, sallow complexion, grey hair and eyes. We know she was outspoken and could be verbally abusive in her interactions with police and, for example, the hotel owners whose property she targeted, such as the Colonel Light Hotel in Light Square. But what we do not know about her life in South Australia is a lot, because what we do know is gleaned from the sort of skeletal details provided by police reports, prison authorities, and her court appearances. Most significantly and sadly, we do not know where, when, or why she died. After she was released with James on licence from the Gladstone Inebriates prison on the 7th of March 1923, Bridget simply disappears from the public record. We don't know anything about her literacy levels. Both her marriage certificates were signed with a cross, indicating that she could not write. But 2 prison records refer to her being able to read, but most refer to her inability to read or write. So to conclude, thanks to newspapers and criminal record keeping, we have glimpses of Bridget's life in South Australia in the 45 years between 1878 and 1923, and the 265 convictions of a woman of pluck. Although locating and presenting the details hardly constitutes Bridget as a woman with recognised power, this research process by Stephanie and by Anita has given her a voice. Thank you.
Well, I think that's been enormously rich to think about the South Australian female experience through the lens of Irishness. And what I'd like to do now is just ask one or two questions to warm up the conversation and then throw it open to the audience to ask questions. There'll be a roving mic in a minute, and it will be handed to you, so you can, you're welcome to introduce yourself before you ask the question. But just to warm us up, because I think sometimes it's hard to start with a question, I wanted to ask you both about what you think your research has told us about South Australia more generally. And I'm thinking about Wakefield's vision for South Australia and how it really was about kind of Protestant couples, happy, enlightened capitalist couples coming to South Australia and establishing a kind of little Britain here. And so ostensibly, I guess, the Irish were excluded from that original vision. And I'm just wondering, the Irish were such a massive part of the New South Wales and the Van Diemen's Land settlement story, and even the Victorian or Port Phillip story. What can we learn from your research about colonial South Australia and the way they engaged with Irishness? Do you want to start with that one, Susan, and then over to you, Denise?
Okay. Yep. Well, it's a very interesting question. And I guess for me, it's really interesting because South Australia and the way it was set up is sort of capitalism writ large, isn't it? Mm. And then when you look at Kapunda, it's all about pastoralism and it's all about mining, and that really is capitalism. And then you have this little corner of about 400 acres where the Irish have settled in, and they're not going anywhere no matter who thinks they actually own that land, because obviously it's the Irish. And what they did was set up this system of living called the Clachan and Rundale system. And that is a very cooperative way of living. So you have access to a piece of land, you have your own animals and you have your own house, but you make the decisions about how that land is managed together, and you make the decision about where you're going to put crops in together. And it's a very cooperative, community-focused way of living, which is a very good way of living on sustainable land. So it helps everybody to survive well. This is what people would have done in Ireland before they left Ireland. But that system was dying out because of the effects post-famine and the land clearances, and again, capitalism being writ large there, where land was being cleared to allow bigger farms and so on. So the Irish that came to Kapunda and Baker's Flat started living the same sort of lives that they had lived in Ireland, maybe unconsciously, but eventually really, really consciously, because they were defending that to the death. And it's like you've got capitalism and then this little bit of cooperative living side by side. And I guess what I am really happy about is being able to tell that story and make it more well known, so that we know that South Australia has a complex history. And just because it wasn't all written down at the beginning doesn't mean, as historians and archaeologists, that we can't find it later.
That's wonderful, Susan.
It's a very long answer, sorry.
Well, we want long answers, don't we? We want long, rich answers. And I'm struck in your answer there that the thing about the South Australian population might be a feature too, that the British colonial project could smash and destroy those cultural traditions in Ireland in a way that proved harder to do in the South Australian context. So at the same time, an experiment or a cultural practice had an opportunity to get its roots down and survive or thrive even.
Yeah, really thrive, yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. And Denise, the thing about Mary Lee, which offers such an important pivot point of contrast, is that she's Protestant as opposed to Roman Catholic. And so she had a different sort of mobility within the South Australian context, and yet not. So what do you think her story tells us? It sounds like she's 60 when she becomes this political agitator?
I think, is that on? What I picked up from my research was really around class, more than the religious discrimination. And I think if I'd gone looking for that, I would have found much more of it. But the class discrimination was much more obvious. And I think that a lot of the antagonism directed at her was because she wasn't middle class. She was one of many women who worked with suffrage and who worked on various campaigns, including women like Mary Colton, who was president of the Women's Suffrage League, and also involved in something like 25 charities at that time. And there were other English women. Augusta Zaddo had come from Germany, so there was a mix, different cultural mix. But I think for Mary, because she was Irish and because she was working class, that a lot of the criticisms were directed at her for that reason. And I think also what it did was it also allowed her the scope to be much more articulate, and because she was articulate by nature, she could speak out without fear, the same fear of retribution. She was a single older woman. Many of the other women whom she worked with were married to politicians and to important business people, and I imagine that some of their behaviour was curtailed by the men that they were with. And that may have been the case a little bit with the Coltons. I'm not sort of all that familiar with their relationship. But Mary Colton in particular was extremely generous and achieved a great deal, but it was always done extremely politely. She did not cross any boundaries. And she was never also attacked. I've not found any criticism of her at all. So, which is quite interesting considering that they were actually working for the same thing.
And one of the things that really struck me in your presentation, I'm not sure about the rest of the audience, but I'd be keen to know. I didn't know about her engagement in union movements. Did everybody else in the room know that, or is it a new thing for some people? So is it a new thing for anybody? I mean, it seems extraordinary that she's taking such a powerful lead there. And I wonder if, again, population might somehow play a role there, that, you know, she's an older woman, she can assume authority. In a sense, she's got nothing to lose. And so she's just going hard as a big fish in a small pond where she can actually create waves and change.
I think a lot of her work with working women was the situations that she discovered. She actually worked on the streets. So she would, and she was also involved, I mentioned Augusta Zaddo, who was the first, I think, female factory visitor. And Augusta Zaddo and Mary became very close friends and colleagues. And together they really changed legislation and worked with these different organisations. And I think it really was because it was just first-hand experience. She just came across it. And I think in her mind, and I think that is that sort of perhaps, you know, her Irish origins taught her that you speak up, that if there's an injustice done, you make a statement, you make a move. And what she realised was that lots of other people were not doing that. They were just ignoring it. And I think she just thought, I'm just going to say something here and just see what happens.
Let us be up and doing, you know, the famous Tennyson poem. Yeah.
I was just going to say, do you think the fact that she was educated as well, so she would have had the language that she could use, would have made a difference?
Absolutely. And if you... I followed up on many of the letters because as has been highlighted, women's history was not recorded. It was really difficult to find women's history if it's not in association with the men in their lives. However, the South Australian Register and South Australian Advertiser provide comprehensive reports on what was happening for things like the women's suffrage movement. from where people held meetings, from who they were with, for how many people were at the meeting, for whatever was discussed. And what I did was I went through extensively hundreds of these letters to the editor, many from Mary Lee and her colleagues, and the corresponding reports that would happen. So you could kind of gather from that. Now, if Mary had not been as articulate and as educated as she was, there is no way that she would have had that device to educate people or to, I guess, form relationships with politicians and other, the union movement, other religious organisations. If she wasn't articulate, that never would have happened. No.
And I love in her story, and I think it's also there in the Kapunda women, the Baker's Flat women, that in Mary's case, she's 67. That's retirement age, right? She's 67 and she's just...
I'm 67.
She's just getting going. I mean,
Yeah.
and there's another 23 years of dangerous behaviour. It's truly inspiring, isn't it?
She made me feel a little bit exhausted.
Yeah. I've got one more question for you both, and then I hope you're starting to ask, you've got your questions cooking away. And I just wanted to ask you both how this research changed you, what you learnt from it, what's changed and shifted in you and what you've learnt. So would you like to start with that, Denise?
I took a very personal approach. I love Mary Lee, and I am a single older woman, and I think one of the reasons that I engaged with her was because it resonated with me, that at a certain point in your life, you either start doing things or being active, or there's no time limit to anything. So for me personally, sometimes I am shamed by the little that I do in relation to what she did. When I read about it, I think, oh my God, I don't even know whether she really liked me in real life, because, I don't do all the things that she did. But ever since I sort of engaged with her story, I've got left with this feeling of confidence and why not? And my age now does not limit me in any way, shape or form. It's of no regard. And I figure, well, she worked until she was almost 90 years old.
Great. So everybody who wants Denise
to
get involved in something.
Yeah, I just took it very personally.
Yeah, absolutely. How can you not be inspired by that story and the complaints and the constant determination to make life better? And I'm struck by her long-sighted compassion. She's seeing in ways that so many other people in the world just couldn't see. What a gift that she's left us with. Susan, what about for you? There's a really personal side of that story, and I hear in your story, in your research, about one finding these things as an archaeologist and recovering that place. And then there's also this sense of a moment in time where Irish culture replanted itself and in the process brought something to life that was fragmenting in Ireland itself.
Interesting, because I came late to archaeology, so like one of those women that went, well, if not now, when? And I was talking to Hamish earlier on, and Hamish and I worked together many years ago when I worked for the Environment Department. So at that point in my life, I was building big websites and managing web services and so on. And I'd always had this hankering for history and archaeology, and sort of I came to a point where I went, maybe I'll go back and I'll do a graduate diploma in archaeology and just see what it's like, just out of interest. Well, the very first topic, the very first tutorial, I was hooked. And then I realised, my God, you could do a master's in this stuff. I'd love to do something about Ireland and South Australia, because these are the two big things in my life. Like, I grew up in Ireland, I was born in Ireland, I was raised in Ireland, I went to university in Ireland, and then I came to Australia, to South Australia in my 20s. And although we've moved around a bit, I've sort of been based here ever since then, so it's a really big part of my life. So then, by a whole happenstance, I came across this area called Baker's Flat and went up and spoke to people in Kapunda, a couple of people that still knew about the site, and they were interested to show it to me, and a couple of other people knew about it. Dimphna Lonergan was the person who was one of the co-editors of the book, had talked about it to begin with. And then the very first time I set foot on Baker's Flat with the permission of the landowner and with a community member there and a couple of archaeologists, I felt like I'd come home. And I don't even know exactly why that was, but it was something about the pepper trees, which of course are not in Ireland. But beside the pepper trees were these thorny bushes. To me, they were hawthorns, which Irish people plant beside their houses to keep away the witches and the fairies. And there was ceramics and glass scattered around, and some of it was banded ware, which is like a fancy name for what archaeologists term stripes of blue or brown around the ceramic vessel. And again, these are things that are very, very popular to this day in Ireland. So I sort of felt this sense of Irishness on Baker's Flat. And I'd never felt it so strongly before in South Australia. And that was what sort of, I guess, made me really interested. And then the more I read and the more I looked, the more I found out about South Australia, the more I was interested in the history and how it came about and why and who the people were and this Irish people and all the people they were connected with. So it's changed me profoundly because I've always been Irish and I've always said I was Australian, but now I'm Irish and I am definitely South Australian because I sort of feel it in my bones now, and that's been really important. Yeah.
Oh, they were great questions, weren't they? Okay, see what you guys can come up with. Who's got a question? We've got about 5 to 6 minutes for some questions. Sky. Sky's got a question over there. Excellent.
Thank you all very much, and wonderful presentations. Susan, a question for you. So, did you say that this is the only place outside Ireland that this community, so that's amazing.
Yes. Yeah.
And why here? Like, and I just wanted to ask, you know, the Bagot, Charles Harvey Bagot and Gleeson.
Yeah.
Did they sort of look after the Irish that came here? What's the relationship between those pastoralists and the Irish?
There's definitely a really strong connection with Charles Harvey Bagot because he was the owner of the mine at the time that the Irish arrived. And of course he had brought, Loretta will correct me if I'm wrong, 226, 227, Irish migrants with him when he came over on the Burman in the 1840s. And there is some evidence that there is a line in an article that says, and some of them went to join Bagot at Kapunda. So we know there's sort of a tenuous link, but there is a very strong link because the Baker's Flat land was owned by Bagot to begin with. He was the first purchaser of it. He then sold it on very quickly. But I think he was going, okay, I own the mine, there's a whole bunch of Irish people who just arrived, settle in there, it'll be fine, I know the owners, I'll sort it out. So I think there is that definite connection between Bagots. Not so much between Gleeson and the Irish on Baker's Flat that I've been able to see, but maybe that was a little bit too far north. And in terms of it being the first Claughan and Rundale system outside of Ireland, that's true, it is so far, but I don't think that means it's the only one. I think it's the only one that's been recognised so far. And certainly there are some areas in Canada where houses are clustered together, built by Irish people and have been called Claughans because they are built in that sort of higgledy-piggledy type cluster. However, what's different is that in South Australia, they had land. So they didn't just have a little bit of land to put their houses on. They had 400 acres of land where they could actually manage it. And I think that's what the difference is, that they had a landscape that they could see and decide how to manage in the same way as they've been able to do in the past.
And they were going to fight to keep it.
Definitely, yes.
I was thinking about the Port Fairy,
Yes.
which is another community,
Yeah.
a strongly Irish community, but I don't think they had that higgledy-piggledy.
No, and also a Croit, which is
Yeah,
not far.
yeah.
And but that was very, and there were lots and lots of Irish, but they basically all had their own bit of land with their
Yeah.
sort of a rectangle and a
Yeah.
house on it.
Yeah.
So it wasn't managed communally at
Yeah.
all, although there is a really strong Irish tradition there. Yes.
And these migrant groups, whether it's the Germans in Barossa, also setting up and being able to create such a strong sense of culture and community there. It seems to be something that I've not seen it in the New South Wales and in Port Phillip district in the same way. So something is happening here, I think. It's worthy of more investigation. Another question for our presenters. Yes, at the front. We'll just let the mic come down. Thank you very much. You're welcome to introduce and say your name.
Hi, I'm Roz, and yeah, we keep coming to these talks. They're really interesting. What I wanted to ask, though, just basically a follow-on from there. When the mine closed down, did the sediment disperse? What happened to all the people?
That's an excellent question. I could keep talking for about 45 minutes on that. So, the mine closed down. The Irish did not leave. So the mine closed in 1879, and the last Irish person died on Baker's Flat in 1945. Now, by then, most people had moved on. So as people saved money, they bought land further out. So there's records of people going over to Broken Hill, going over to Burra, going further north, almost as far as Peekina as well. So there's lots of evidence of people going further north and sometimes south as land became available that they could access. So I think the people with means were leaving from about the early 20th century. And then it was the older people, the poorer people, the people without resources that were left on the land. Now, the really interesting story is that the Driscolls, who I sort of mentioned as being a very important family, at one stage around 1929 or thereabouts, for an archaeologist and historian, I am very bad on dates, so it's around that time. The land finally got sold out of the consortium, and it was Paddy Driscoll that bought the land, who was one of the Driscolls. And he never sold the land and did nothing with it until the last person died on Baker's Flat. So I think that his decision was, I'm keeping this land in the way we've always intended it be used for the people. And when the last person dies, which was 1945, after that, then I'll sell it out of the family. But until then, we'll keep it so that people have stability. And the landowner of the land now still calls it Driscoll's Paddock.
Yeah, another question down here. And Corinne, I'm looking at you and wondering if you want to talk at all about the about Stephanie's paper as well. So I've got my eye on you. But yes, please ask a question.
Hello. Mine's more of a comment. I'm horrified and sad on behalf of Bridget. I'd never heard of her, but I just saw her, as you described her, as a figure of fun, which is horrible. I mean, if she lived now, she would have got some help, wouldn't she? Someone would have helped her.
Yeah.
But she was put up as being a notorious drunken, a record of all those convictions, and it's just, I just think it's horrible that she's looked at and mentioned now in that way. And, you know, she was someone's daughter, someone's, wife, and I don't think it's nice.
No, you're right, and I'm sorry if you thought that I was positioning her as a figure of fun.
Yeah.
No, and I think Stephanie and Anita are very careful about that. And it's something that they both feel very similarly to you about, that this is not a pretty story, but it is actually, as I hope Corinne might say in a moment, it is exemplary or of the way that many women, not just Irish women, but many 19th century working women lived in Adelaide. And I think it's a story that we need to people the past with them as well. You know, we need to feel their spirits when we walk down Hindley Street. They need to be part of our past. and it's not a pretty past. Over to you, my friend. Would you like to talk a little bit about Mabel as another, a kind of contemporary, I think? Is that right?
Yeah, they are contemporaneous. So I wrote a book about a very bad girl called Mabel Worley, who was not Irish. She was the daughter of Scots and English migrants who also spent a lot of time on Highley Street drinking and spent a lot of time in Gladstone Inebriates Asylum with Bridget. And I'd love to talk to Stephanie about that at some point, because I spent a lot of time going over the medical records and the letters that are there. But yes, so there's there's a whole undercurrent of hard drinking women who spend decades living on the streets, living these sort of lives. Bridget, I think, is 260-something. Sarah Francisco, who's the famous drunk of Port Adelaide, she was, again, very proud of that. She had 295 convictions, more than probably. And she also did things like refuse to walk out of court. She made policemen carry her. So, these women who were essentially, in many ways, powerless, exerted their power whenever they could. My subject, Mabel, she did nearly a decade at Gladstone under these very harsh inebriates offences. So people who'd been convicted more than 3 times in a year. Then you got compulsory sentences at Gladstone as an inebriate. The first one was 18 months, the second one was 2 years, and the third one was at His Majesty's pleasure. So all of these women and men were at the pointy end of new legislation in the 19-teens, which was aimed at addressing problem drinking, particularly obviously amongst working class people. So Bridget is unfortunately not alone. She's in many ways typical. Most women would not have racked up to 300, but even Mabel, my subject, she has 20, 30, 40, 50 convictions. She's got over 40 on her Victorian record and at least as many here. One of the things I would love to ask Stephanie is if she's looked into state, because Mabel on at least 2 occasions is given a railway pass by the Salvation Army to leave. They defer sentencing for 24 hours or 48 hours to allow them to try and leave. Doesn't turn out well for my girl. She burns too many bridges, and maybe that's what happens to Bridget. So these women and men tried to exert personal power when they could. They flit out from hospital when they're drying out when they can. They do all sorts of things. So it's power and powerlessness in exactly the same way that you guys have talked about. But yes, so I agree with Kiera, recovering them, bringing their names back, honouring them, and recognising that they were people who are often very troubled. Certainly Mabel is institutionalised by the end of her life, and I would suggest that that's very much Bridget's experience as well. But they're really important, and we still have many issues around addiction and homelessness that we like to think we handle better, but actually those same attitudes about deserving and undeserving are still with us. And I'll get back off my soapbox. Thank you.
I think that's absolutely right. And for the Irish in Australia, it's very, very loaded, because as we've talked about, the Irish were seen, they were so often depicted in cartoons for simian features, and, the themes of alcohol and dirt and disorderliness, etc., etc. They were just motifs that ran through depictions of the Irish. And it does sound like these women are seeking to re-institutionalise themselves, performatively, but also for their well-being. So I think there's a lot more inquiry that we can do, both into the past, but how the legacy of that continues to reverberate in the present. We've got time. Did you, one of you want to...
I'm just wondering, when I was listening to the large number of incarcerations, whether it wasn't a form of accommodation.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. A place for a feed and a shelter.
Does that sort of come up in your research?
Yeah.
Stephanie's research.
Oh, in Stephanie.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But no, I guess I also just wanted to say as well that, and when we laugh, we're laughing with the sense of a woman who's witty and a woman who's strong and a woman who's surviving against all odds as well. So it's not a laughing at. It's like, and maybe that's, sometimes like a particularly Irish and Australian thing to do as well, but it's acknowledging the awfulness of something and the horrible and the trauma that has probably gone beforehand and continues. But still, here's a woman that will stand up and throw her hat across the court because she is strong enough to do that. And somebody then has to acknowledge that in some way. It has to be written, it has to be recorded, and that way then we can find her voice again.
Yeah. I mean, if there's one thing all three stories share tonight, is that none of them were broken. All of them defied. And maybe that's where we should finish, on that spirit of defiance. Let us be up and doing. A wonderful line from Mary Lee from Tennyson's fabulous poem. So to wrap up tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the incredible hard work of Suze Redman, Christy Kogegi and the rest of the audience and engagement team at the History Trust. These things involve lots of moving parts over periods of times and curved walls at the last moment, but we've got there. I'd like to thank you, the audience, your active listening, your leaning forward, your smiles, your noddings. They mean so much when you're up here in a conversation. So thank you. And I'm sure that our speakers share that. And finally, to these fabulous speakers for their research, their interdisciplinary care, their passion for these people, and for bringing them to us. We're richer. We're richer for what we've learnt tonight. So thank you very much to you both. Oh, and we've got some chockies for yous too.